Um, Wonderful. So our next speaker will be Lynn Maxwell. Lynn Maxwell is Associate Professor of English Literature at Spelman College, where she teaches classes in early modern literature. Her research interests include gender and sexuality, posthumanism, and emergent scientific thought in the period. Recent publications include her book, Wax Impressions, Figures and Forms in Early Modern Literature, Waxworks, and articles in the Journal for Early Modern Cultural Studies and Criticism. Today, Lynn will be looking at the distinctions that Cavendish draws between patterning and generation in her philosophical letters, and how those possibilities relate to thoughts, books, and children. So over to you, Lynn.
Great. Sorry, I'm very talented at this Zooming. Okay, so yeah, I do think that my presentation today has a lot to say in conversation with the presentations we've already seen, and particularly with Laura's. So I'm excited to see the conversations that we have. So in past work on Margaret Cavendish, I have considered her concept of patterning as a mode of relation that resists the binaries of active and passive, and by extension challenges traditional concepts of gender. In her philosophical letters, Cavendish rewrites the trope of signet seal, a trope famously bound up in metaphors of reproduction in the early modern period, to invest in agency in all positions. As she explains, if a seal be printed upon wax, 'tis true, it is the figure of the seal which is printed on the wax. But yet the seal doth not give the wax the print of its own figure, but it is the wax that takes the print or pattern from the seal and patterns or copies it out in its own substance.
Lynn, may I pause you briefly, Lynn? We're not seeing your slides at this point.
You're not seeing my slides?
Could you try that one more time? Sorry for the interruption.
Sorry. It says it's failed to start. All right, let me try something else. Or just restart it.
Yeah, would you mind just restarting it from just clicking share screen? And now we're seeing, perfect. We're seeing your slides.
Okay. So when I go into this mode, can you still see it?
Now we're good. Thank you so much.
Okay. I don't know why that didn't work.
I'm so sorry for the interruption. Do you want to start back up from the start, or?
Sure. I mean,
or pick back up from where you were. Okay. Either one.
I'll figure it out. Okay, so I'll just start after the quote. And so if you go read my book, I talk a lot about the role of wax and seals as this trope for reproduction. But so I came at this paper sort of sideways going, okay, so that was fine and good, but what happens if we actually pay attention to what she has to say about generation instead of just how she's using this trope that normally has to do with generation, but she's not really using it for that. So by reimagining the exchange between wax and seal in terms of patterning, Cavendish creates space for female agency, particularly around reproduction. But this space, suggestive as it might be, does not actually represent Cavendish's understanding of conception. Instead, when she explicitly considers generation elsewhere in the philosophical letters, she explains that they do not proceed through patterning, but through a different, deeper process that requires the impartation of both matter and motion. The action of patterning is without translation, for to pattern out is nothing else but to imitate, and to make a figure in its own substance or parts of matter like another figure. But in generation, every producer does transfer both matter and motion, that is, corporeal motion, into the produced. And if there be more producers than one, they all do contribute to the produced. And if one creature produces many creatures, those many creatures do partake more or less of their producer. So reproduction for Cavendish is an act of creation that goes beyond mere copying. To generate a new creature, the producers must transfer both matter and motion and materially contribute to the act of creation. Interestingly, neither the number or sex of the producers is specified here. Cavendish does not discard the possibility of parthenogenesis or limit the number of producers to 2. Instead, generation is offered as an expansive natural process that is different from patterning primarily because of its transformative nature. This vision of generation, which she develops in Philosophical Letters, is consistent with Cavendish's larger insistence that everything is material, new matter cannot be created, and that all matter is self-moving. Her ideas around these questions are, of course, not in line with her peers. Indeed, the Philosophical Letters proceeds as a series of responses to questions about more famous works of natural philosophy. Thus, Cavendish's ideas are always offered in conversation. In our discussion of generation, she is responding to William Harvey's anatomical exhortations concerning the generation of living creatures. Harvey, unable to observe what happens after sex and before a visible fetus in the dissections that he performed, theorizes that conception might occur via an immaterial transmission from the man. Quote, "For there is nothing to be found abiding in the womb after coition, for the geniture of the male doth either suddenly fall out again or vanish away, and the blood doth circulate again from the uterus by the vessels." Without an observable material cause for the formation of the fetus, Harvey concludes that the womb must work like the brain. For as we, from the conception of the form or idea in the brain, do fashion a form like to it in our works, so doth the idea or species of the genitor residing in the uterus by the help of the formative faculty beget a fetus like the genitor himself, namely by implanting that immaterial species which it hath upon its workmanship. Generation then proceeds as the builder erects a house according to his pre-received conception. The exact relationship between uterus and brain in Harvey's work is a bit ambiguous. Mental conception is both metaphor and more than metaphor, as the appetites of the brain become the appetites of the uterus and take on generative power. Yet Harvey insists that the man must be responsible for the act of authorship and prove the genitor, even as he grasps for a mechanism to explain how that might be accomplished. Of course, Cavendish disagrees with Harvey about how conception occurs in both brain and womb. She explains, "Conceptions of the brain, in my opinion, are not immaterial, but corporeal. For though the corporeal motions of the brain, or the matter of its conceptions, is invisible to humane creatures, and that when the brain is dissected, there is no such matter found, yet that does not prove that there is no matter, because it is not so gross a substance as to be perceptible by our exterior senses." Where for Harvey, both mental and reproductive conception have immaterial instigators, Cavendish insists on the materiality of thought and by extension, everything else. Instead of thinking with Harvey about what might be visible within a dissected womb, Cavendish imagines the dissection of a brain and suggests that such an exercise would be futile because of the limits of our exterior senses. Indeed, for Cavendish, our inability to perceive thoughts is hardly remarkable, given that most of nature's works are not so gross as to be subject to our exterior sense. The human body may be dissectable, the brain observable, but such observations are largely irrelevant to understanding the workings of nature. Yet while Cavendish disagrees with Harvey about the value of dissection, the materiality of thought, and the process of generation, she seems to concur that there is something fundamentally similar between a conception in the brain and natural productions or generations. She continues, "Neither will your author's example hold that as a builder erects a house according to his conception in the brain, the same happens in all other natural productions or generations. For in my opinion, the house is materially made in the brain. That is, the house, when it is conceived in the brain, is made by the rational, corporeal, figurative motions of their own substance or degree of matter. But if all animals should be produced by mere fancies, and a man and a woman should beget by fancying themselves together in copulation, then the produced would be a true Platonic child. But if a woman, being from her husband, should be so got with child, the question is whether the husband would own the child. And if amorous lovers, which are more contagious for appetite and fancy than married persons, should produce children by immaterial contagions, there would be more children than parents to own them." Where Harvey suggests that we might understand generation as being like workmen executing the builder's plan, Cavendish objects by arguing that in conceiving the house, the builder has already materially made it in the brain, or rather that the rational, corporeal, figurative motions of the brain's matter have made it. For Cavendish, these acts of conception and construction would most likely proceed either via a self-guided figurative movement or patterning, not generation. However, even as she dismisses the possibility of all animals being produced by minds, she seems excited by that possibility, and the lines between mind and womb, thought and child, seem tenuously upheld. Conceptions of the mind cannot explain babies or animals, but might their products be like children? If the difference between generation and other movements is the transference of corporeal motion, might that be accomplished by the mind? And if the products of the mind are too airy for human perception, how do we know that we have not produced an abundance of ethereal offspring who in turn might be producing their own? Certainly, this possibility seems an open question in Cavendish's philosophy. In Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, she again considers the relationship between the production of thoughts and the production of children. This time, she is in the process of explaining how matter consists of an admixture of rational, sensitive, and inanimate parts. Such a mixture is necessary to balance and poise nature's actions, that otherwise the creatures which nature produces would all be produced alike and in an instant. For example, a child in the womb would as suddenly be framed as it is figured in the mind, and a man would be as suddenly dissolved as a thought, but sense and reason perceives that it is otherwise. While Cavendish is attentive to the differences in how children and thoughts manifest in the world and the permanence of their existence, here the child in the womb sits comfortably alongside one's figured in the mind, and both ask to be acknowledged, even if only temporarily. Indeed, Cavendish seems most uncomfortable with the idea that mental conception and bodily conception might mix. She's very interested in rejecting theories of maternal impression, and with them, the idea that desire might shape the womb or secure its successes, while she has no problem imagining these different types of generation, as long as they don't mix. The possibilities of alternative offspring recurs in Cavendish's conceptualization of books as children. Books, of course, offer one way to solve the shortcomings of conceptions of the brain. They are more slowly realized, have longer lifespans, and are more readily perceivable due to their more substantial materiality. In her Poems and Fancies, she writes, "Condemn me not for making such a coil about my book. Alas, it is my child." And again, in the Grounds of Natural Philosophy, she asks the learned societies of Europe to be propitious to the birth of this beloved child of my brain. In the same introduction, she claims the right to be a fond and doting mother to her philosophical work, explaining, "It is so commonly the error of indulgent parents to spoil their children out of fondness, that I may be forgiven for spoiling this and never putting it to suck at the breast of some learned nurse." While the trope of book as child and child as book is frequently deployed in the 17th century, Cavendish pushes it further than most by rendering it physical via the reference to suckling. And when read alongside her philosophy, these claims seem to become more than metaphor. Indeed, her literary works repeatedly ask about the possibility of creating an enduring legacy by means other than biological reproduction. In Youth, Glory, and Death Banquet, one of Cavendish's closet dramas, the play opens with a debate about the education of father love and mother's love's only child, a daughter named Sanparelle. Mother love accuses father love of being overly strict and raising her on books, and worries that the only happiness such an education might bring her daughter is to walk idly about the Elysium fields. She concludes, "Thus you breed your daughter as if your posterity were to be raised from a poet's fantastical brain." At stake in this accusation is an implicit claim by mother love that the kind of education being provided here will not lead to grandchildren, at least not fleshy ones. Instead, Sanparelle will be capable only of producing poetry herself, or perhaps in reading so much poetry, Sanparelle might become herself a creation of poetry, which of course she already is, insofar as she is a character of Cavendish's imagining. While mother love means to be dismissive here, a poet's posterity seems an acceptable outcome in the play. Father love exclaims, "I wish my posterity may last as long as Homer's lines." And while mother love scoffs that truly it will be a fine, airy brood, neither Sanparelle nor her father are concerned about that airiness. Later in the play, Sanparelle explicitly asks if her father will think her unnatural if she fails to provide him with grandchildren, and he scoffs, "Unnatural? No. And for my posterity, I had rather it should end with merit than run on in follies." Buoyed by this response, Sanparelle reveals her plan never to marry, and instead live a virgin life devoted to study, oration, authorship, and fame. Given the trajectory of Cavendish's own life, it is hardly surprising that she celebrates Sam Perel's choices here and advances the value of alternative offspring or of a posterity not rooted in flesh. We might also think of The Blazing World, which substitutes world creation for motherhood, and indeed scarcely considers the possibility of children and imagining what the lives of women might look like. Read together, Cavendish's fiction and natural philosophy ask us to take seriously these various kinds of conception, their relation to each other, and their place in structuring human relations. Her response to Harvey de-emphasizes the role of gender in generation, shifting away from a consideration of male ejaculate in the female womb to a consideration of the brain and to a purposefully ungendered generative process. She literally calls the womb the place of architecture. Thus, for Cavendish, the roles of men and women become arbitrary and cultural rather than natural. She also begins to destabilize the idea that bodily human reproduction is the most important kind of reproduction, or even the dominant way in which humans reproduce. Thought babies outnumber their grosser counterparts, and these airy offspring or their more hefty counterparts, orations and books, might prove better conduits for securing a lasting futurity beyond one's own biological limits in the form of fame or poetic glory. More than that, if, as The Blazing World suggests, we might be able to generate not only conceptual offspring, but also entire worlds, each every bit as material as our own, our attention to the production and maintenance of fleshy families might be entirely misplaced.